Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Firstly, a content warning. This episode includes brief discussion of suicide. In this episode, we're looking at the ethics of long COVID and the ways it's reshaping how we think about disability, care and community. Long COVID has left millions of people living with chronic symptoms, often without adequate medical or state support. A recent study found a mortality rate for long COVID of 15% at 1 year post-discharge. Philosopher Élaina Gauthier-Mamaril joins me to talk about her project, which uses podcasting not only to share stories, but also as a disability-centred research method, archiving the knowledge and resilience of disabled communities. We'll explore ideas such as disability doulas, the legacy of HIV activism, and what needs to change in how we respond to disability in the wake of COVID. So I'm here with Élaina Gauthier-Mamaril. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jim.
We're going to talk about a project that you're engaged in around long COVID, and particularly we're interested in disability community knowledge. So knowledge that might have been generated within the disabled community and ways in which that might be helpful to people who are living with and dealing with long COVID, right? So I would be grateful if you could start by just telling us a little bit about what the project is and what inspired it.
Yeah, so the project will hopefully be, once I get the grant, looking at how we can better understand what I'm calling disabled community knowledge around practices of mutual aid that go beyond the crisis moment. So with people who are listening, we've mostly all been through the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we've seen lots of instances of mutual aid happen when people need groceries or access to their meds, or when people need air conditioning or lots of other things. And people will assemble, and we've seen beautiful movements of solidarity across the globe on that. And that is also something that is part of disability communities. And I don't want to take away from that. However, with people who will have complex access needs for their whole lives, or who develop an energy limiting condition like long COVID, mutual aid will take other forms as well that will not only happen in those crisis moments. Yes. So my question is, what happens when crisis becomes chronic? Mm-hmm. And so I want to be able to map that, capture that, interrogate that, because my background is through relational autonomy and looking at the UK healthcare system. Okay. So in my previous work, I've really noticed that there is kind of cultural misunderstanding or clash between the biomedical model and the lived experience knowledge of people with disabilities. And so the conclusions I've come to is that we need to have some kind of brokering, like epistemic brokering between these two communities. Right. And this project hopefully will be one step in addressing that.
Okay, so by epistemic brokering, you mean basically sharing of knowledge, right?
Yes, and when you say it like that, it sounds like very simple, but in my research and also my personal experience as a disabled person who's interacted with medical services in 4 different countries, it's never just as simple as like sharing our knowledge or our ideas or our values or our preferences, because whatever that sharing happens in a hierarchy of knowledge. And also, no human being can be expected to understand all frameworks of knowledge at all times. Mm-hmm. And so I've been involved in medical education and teaching medical students, and the way that they are taught doesn't leave much opening to understand disabled lived experience.
Interesting, yeah. So there's something in the kind of framework or model that they're bringing to, how they're expecting to hear knowledge about the topic, right? Which is informing what they're able to get from the conversations that they're having and potentially closing them down to some avenues. And
yeah, and for many reasons, including the fact that there's such a scarcity of time. When you go see a GP, for example, they will have a grid and they will listen to you and they will try and match it. And if it doesn't match their grid, they don't have time necessarily to ask you follow-up questions so lots of things fall through the cracks. And part of my project is building on the fact that what we call lived experience or experiential knowledge is often put into a binary compared to the factual and procedural knowledge of doctors. And I want to complicate that a bit.
Okay, really interesting. And the project's about long COVID specifically. So I wondered if you could give us some background about long COVID. So, I guess people will be somewhat familiar with it, but what is it? What kind of symptoms does it manifest in? How widespread is it?
So the last Office of National Statistics in the UK, the last report was in May 2023. So there hasn't been an update in about 2 years now. But at that point, about 2 million people in the UK in what they call private households. So this does not include group settings like care homes or prisons, for example. So about 2 million people had it in 2023. So I expect there will be more now. Of that, about 60,000 children under the age of 17. So long COVID is not, as far as we know, a deadly disease. So this means that we will have people living with long COVID for decades. And it is a multi-systemic condition. So the one unifying factor is that it's considered to be persisting symptoms after 12 weeks after a COVID-19 infection. But after that, it has actually really varied. So it can affect pulmonary capacity. People have had trouble breathing, cardiac irregularities, brain clots, a lot of cognitive dysfunction in terms of brain fog as well. And there's lots of kind of damage to different bodily systems that were just too early in tracking. But in terms of how it affects people's daily lives, obviously if you can't breathe, well, that affects you a lot. But in terms of people who develop chronic fatigue, for example, that will affect how long they can work in an office, or if they need more flexible working arrangements, if they're capable to care for their children, or in some cases where they're bedbound, where they can't even care for themselves.
Yeah. Okay. So it would be accurate to say that it is, at least in most cases, a disabling condition then, right? Yeah. And you're interested in disability community knowledge. So could you say a bit about what that is?
Yeah. So this is where my positionality as a disabled philosopher disability comes in, because I can't really dissociate my academic and professional interests in this because of my background in relational autonomy and things like that with my own experience. So going through the pandemic, and this is not just me, I've heard this from other disabled people, there was some kind of elation at the beginning when we were seeing people take it very seriously. And we were seeing people give us access that we've been asking for years, being able to have Zoom meetings and be able to attend lectures remotely and all these things that people have been wanting for years. And now there was a big push. It was being normalized. And I have ME/CFS, or chronic fatigue syndrome. And that is a condition that, again, is non-lethal and is very difficult to pin down. And so the way our medical research system functions is that you have to do a study that produces data that we can then use to do further studies. And with conditions like ME, it's very difficult to get good data, and therefore it becomes very difficult to have funding to do further studies. So as part of that community of saying, it's been decades since, ME sufferers have been disbelieved, not a lot of research money is put into it. And now we were seeing people take COVID very seriously. And we were like, maybe this will happen. And then it didn't. And as we see, I've been tracking, even since last year, 2024, the BMJ has published a third less articles relating to long COVID as we move forward. So the hype and the interest in the community around that is diminishing. And why I wanted to look at disability knowledge is because I was part of that group of people who were like, hey, we have this collective experience. We understand the history of what it means to use services while people don't have the vocabulary or the tools to treat you. And now people seem to be moving on again. And lots of people were being newly disabled by long COVID. And I was like, well, we can't leave them on their own. And then my academic side, my research interest side kicked in. And I was like, okay, let's look at how other communities have dealt with this. And so I looked into post-polio, I looked into ME/CFS, and I looked into HIV.
Right.
And it turns out, well, obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but we do have excellent archives on HIV.
Okay.
And we also have the benefit of history, of seeing the trajectory of what happened in that mutual aid stage before we had good antiretrovirals in 1996. So we have a whole period of seeing how people organized when they were being dismissed by the government, when the public was against them. And then what happened when you had access to good drugs. And then now full circle, when they were aiming for, eradicating HIV by 2030, to having more government intervention removing the drugs that were allowing people to live. So we have not only that capsule of time where we can look at different practices of knowledges of care, but we do also have at least like a map of what could happen to long COVID. Like, let's say like in the next 10 years, they develop really excellent drugs to cure it. What does that mean for knowledges of care? Are they just while we wait for the meds?
Right.
Or are they something that are a broader part of how we live our lives?
Okay. And I guess the experience from HIV would suggest it's the latter, right? It's not that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the argument.
That it's made redundant when the drugs arrive. It's something that's ongoing. Okay, great. So you're going to be hopefully carrying out this project to look at these issues, and you describe the project as following a disability-centered podcasting research method. So what is that? What does it look like in practice? How's it different from more traditional research?
Yeah, very good question. I want to preface, this is experimental, so I don't have all the answers for that. However, what I will say is that I am an experienced podcaster, and so I have the basics of how that works, and I'm an experienced researcher. And I think this is where it kind of benefits me and maybe is a barrier to me that I come from a philosophy background, so I'm not a trained social scientist. So in a way, I approach, ethics and things in a different way because I haven't been trained in that very kind of applied qualitative methods way. And so obviously I care very deeply about ethics, but I kind of find how do I want to treat my participants, and then I find the ethics to work with that, as opposed to I find very frustrating the standard model of ethics process that, for example, will treat all disabled people as like a vulnerable category, which as a philosopher and as a person I find problematic, because when do you respect agency? At what point does a consenting adult not have the right to use their voice to speak to something? And so I'm still exploring what that means. And so the project will still gather anonymized life stories with people. So we will have that option, and it will be completely anonymized and donated to an archive. Participants will also have the option to work on the podcast and co-create on the podcast. And what that means is the core research team, so myself and a postdoc and an advisory board as well, formed from disabled people who are active in the community. We will look at, okay, what is that kind of framework of a podcast we would like to offer to participants? So, not just leave them with no idea, because we can't expect everyone to know what a podcast is. And I also don't believe that's a true like autonomy, empowering space when you're just like, we'll give you no parameters. So like we will come together and we'll devise something to offer. But ultimately with the participants, we'll decide, is this an interview podcast? Is this a different kind of podcast? Like what's the tone and the story? So what I'm billing it as is co-creating a counter archive. So this idea that disabled people's lives are often recorded through their medical charts and criminal records. And how it's important to contribute other ways that we're recording our lives and our stories. So part of the participatory model will involve having workshops where we talk about storytelling and self-advocacy, but also what does it mean to make a podcast that is an archive? Like what does it mean to intentionally share our stories, to build this together, knowing that it will go out to our communities, but also be a point of reference for researchers for years to come. So that's how I'm planning on, having a kind of dynamic process of a dynamic consent process. And then because I'm working with people with energy limiting conditions, I've also built in like a long timeline and different ways that people can interact with the podcast. So we can record interviews. Those interviews can also be spaced out and have time for recovery in between. People can also be involved by sending voice notes, responding to previous episodes, or they can participate in choosing the themes of an episode and kind of discussing how we're constructing it. Or they can produce a piece of writing that they either read out loud or they want someone else to read out loud to be part of the episode. So I'm giving them multiple options depending on interests and capacity to be able to be involved. And as far as anonymity, this is where it gets tricky because, and so I want to reiterate, no one is forced to do the podcast. They can still just do the interviews that are anonymized. If they do the podcast, to respect the form of podcasting, which as a default, we use our names, we don't hide our identities, I want to give that option. And I'm making that case in my ethics application that, as long as everyone is an adult and able to consent and we've explained everything, if they want to be credited and use their name, they should be able to. Obviously, they can use a pseudonym. We can even like digitally alter like the tone of the voice to make it unrecognizable, if you will. Or again, they could choose to submit writing that I or another co-host might read so that it can't be traced back to them. And obviously, if they donate to the archive and to the podcast both, we will have to explain, there's a risk of cross-referencing at some point if someone would find both. So we'll explain all of that up front. And so those are maybe the steps I am taking to make it part of the research model. And the last phase will be where we'll have a reflection workshop where the participants can reflect on the process of building this counter archive with the research team. So really involving people at all stages.
Really interesting. I mean, it sounds great. I'll probably listen myself. I suppose maybe if I could summarize, there's perhaps two main ways in which that methodology looks like it's going to be significantly different from what a traditional research project might look like. So I suppose one thing would be that I take it you're going to be publishing the podcasts along the life of the project, right? Is that right? So
it will happen starting in year 3 or 4 of a 5-year project. So there's quite a lot of work beforehand.
Right. Okay. That's interesting. So is there an element of, kind of creating a bit of a community around the podcast, right, as you go along, and you might actually get people listening who then contact you or want to be involved in the research. So it's kind of iterative in that way. That might be really interesting. Yeah.
I'm also thinking of my own capacity. I don't think I would be able to take on more participants from listening to the podcast. However, I will definitely be involved in, responding to comments and things. And so one of the things that I've put in my bid is working with a podcasting company, a community interest company called Aunt Nell, and they will take charge of a lot of the production and promotion as well. So the plan is for me and the postdoc to do the bulk of the actual work of engaging with participants and crafting the meat, if you will, of the podcast, but that we will be passing on editing, mastering, and all those things to professionals, not because I'm unable to do it, but because I think my role is best served being with the participants and working on the actual research aspect.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, editing is incredibly time consuming. I should just say a nice thank you to Mark, who is our editor, who does our podcast. So without him, I wouldn't be able to do this. Yeah, I suppose, but the other way in which that method looks like it's really valuable and distinctive is in how empowering it is of participants, right? So, I mean, there are many ways in which people try to make research more empowering for participants, but this looks like a really good way of doing that because you're involving people in kind of having input into the way their conversations are going to work, and you're having conversations with them directly, and then allowing them to put that out as a podcast rather than it just kind of going into an archive and them just being a research subject or whatever. It's a bit more, involving.
Yeah. I'm trying to develop a methodology, and hopefully one of the outputs of this will be to produce a kind of podcasting as research protocol that other scholars could use. So not just in this instance, but like, what does it mean to take into account how the process is as well as what the output will be. And so really, this is where my lived experience was really beneficial, thinking about, okay, sometimes you want to participate, but being able to be there synchronously is too much. So how many asynchronous options can I build in? Or not everyone wants to talk on a podcast, either because they can't or they don't want to. They're not comfortable. And I'm a big proponent of there is no radio voice. Like, everyone has the right to be heard. However, I also understand if people don't feel comfortable having their voice out there. So how can you include them? So that's why the writing aspect is possible as well. And then when I thought about the training workshops, so there are a series of workshops that I'm doing with the team beforehand. So I also think that's really important when we're thinking about doing co-creative work. And especially, speaking for myself, but if I also end up hiring someone else who is disabled, when you're doing research on something that is close to you, it can become very emotionally demanding. So I'm doing some training on like access first working beforehand as well. Like, how can we establish a good research culture for us as a team going into this? And then with the workshops with participants, it's really the idea that how can I try and avoid being like, I'm training you in research skills? Because the whole project is about like, what knowledges do you already have? So rather than doing that, I pivoted towards workshops that were talking about, okay, we're doing this together. What does it mean for you to contribute to an archive? Like, how do you understand that? What do you think you will bring to the table? And having more of that idea that you have something to bring, as opposed to I'm coming and extracting something from you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. It really does. Yeah. Great. Okay. Yeah. So to get away from the methodology then, a bit more into the topic. So not that it's not really interesting, but I could talk about that all day, but just the question about long COVID, right? So what kind of do you anticipate being some of the themes that are likely to come up in this research in terms of long COVID and the challenges that people face, and gaps in healthcare and support systems and things like that?
Well, from my previous research and also from, witnessing what people are saying on social media, which is where a lot of the long COVID community gathers, it's the first, to my knowledge, condition that was like self-named over the internet.
Right.
And that the term long COVID persists, even though scientists want to have like post-COVID sequelae or like post-COVID syndrome. They're trying to have like more scientific names, and people are really resisting, and long COVID is continuing in our vocabulary. And so I think from what I'm seeing is a lot of sense of abandonment. People feel, especially people who up until now have been healthy. And I don't blame anyone for this. This is how I was as well. Like, we are trained to be like, well, doctors are here to help us. And for lots of reasons, doctors are unable to help most people with long COVID. And so there is a sense of kind of abandonment that is happening. Also, with something like an energy limiting condition, it's not easy for people who don't experience it to always understand. And so people have experienced a lot of frictions and sometimes abuse from family members and people who, just have very negative reactions to their loved ones' new needs that happen. So that's been happening. So it is a lot of sensitive topics. We also live in a society that increasingly, this is not new. And this is also part of my research of seeing how this tends to happen after social traumas like wars and pandemics, when we have a kind of turn to the far right and we have restrictions on public support. So what we're seeing right now with the proposed disability cuts is a signal that people like me who've been in the community for a while will recognize, but even people with long COVID will say, oh, so we are a burden. And the number of times I've had to stop my research because of all the narratives around suicide that's happening and how that affected me. Like, this is also, so that's what I anticipate. So there's lots of like difficult themes of like, now I feel like my life is not worth living and like the government is telling me I'm not worth it. So that's what I anticipate. But I also anticipate people talking about how they find community online and how people will really reach from across the world and share tips and tricks and do all of that. And with that, of course, I don't want to paint a super rosy picture. I've had to leave online support groups because they become overwhelmingly negative, or people only talk about their bad days, which of course you should be able to do. But then again, if you're constantly in that space of suicidal ideation, it's not a great place to be. And like any human groups, you need moderation because otherwise people get nasty. So I don't want to portray, online support as ideal, but I do think that there are some beautiful things that are being shared. So when people are facing disbelief or misunderstandings in their geographical personal lives, they can find a lot of support online. And I've seen people, crowdfund to have like a nurse assistant or things like that to help people. So, so I anticipate seeing a lot of that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Fascinating. And one of the ideas that struck me in your project is this idea of the disability doula. So could you tell me a bit about what that is and what does it mean in this context?
Yeah. So I use the term disability doula. It's basically the same as crip doula, which is a term that was coined by the late disability activist Stacey Park Milburn, whose birthday was yesterday, 19th of May. And so Milburn coined this to talk about people who help newly disabled people or people who are disabled in a new way. Like, let's say you were already a wheelchair user, but now you have long COVID on top of that. So like you might have still things to learn. So this idea of a doula being traditionally associated with someone, a non-clinical companion to childbirth, for example.
Yes, yeah.
So they'll be with the pregnant person before and then during the childbirth and postnatally as well. But the idea of doula in this sense is taken broadly as someone who helps you through a transition or a life transition. And so we have increasingly become aware of terms like death doula, of people who are in palliative care, or abortion doulas, of people who go through abortions. And so crip doula, so crip, I don't know if you need me to explain that.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it might shock a few listeners. Crip theory is something that has come about from queer theory and disability studies and media studies, but it's also part of a movement, grassroots movement in communities. It's a reclaiming of the slur cripple.
Right.
And at its heart, it is an anti-assimilationist term. So when we talk about disability studies and disability advocacy, it's not a monolith. It's a wide spectrum of different political stances. And in a way, CRIP signals is like a shorthand to signal a way of we don't only want to be included and like be made as close to able-bodied as possible. We want to be part of society in our full selves. So similar to how queer is a slur and has been like reappropriated, CRIP is the same. I want to say not every disabled people likes it and uses it, and I will never call someone that if they don't want to be called that. I use it, but it's not for me only an identity marker. I always say like you can be CRIP and you can do CRIP. You can be CRIPing. So this idea of like the CRIP doula is like this practice of like, how do I help you adjust to your new life, which might involve very practical things like how do you apply for benefits, or can I accompany you to see your GP, to more psychological and emotional needs of like, you used to be a marathon runner and now you can't get out of bed.
Yeah.
Like I'm someone who's been there, like maybe I can like help you.
So I was going to say, is the fact of having had that experience yourself a necessary part of being a doula? Because I suppose, as you say, the familiar context for it, or the context in which I'm most familiar with it, is in childbirth, right? So you have doulas, but it tends to be people who've had children themselves and they've been through that experience. They're not medical professionals, but they can tell you, what to expect, and they can help you through it with the benefit of their lived experience. So is that part of this as well?
Yeah, so that's interesting because I do know people who are doulas who have not had children. And it's an interesting question. So I would say, yes, you would need to have some kind of lived experience. I don't think you need to have the same diagnosis necessarily. I do believe and that we should encourage also like cross disability support for each other. I'm also wary of saying that no able-bodied person can do that because, and this is why looking at HIV is very interesting. When we look at people who've supported their partners, for example, for a long time and been very invested in the HIV activism movement, and this is where concepts such as like leaky bodies happen. And it's like, I'm not personally disabled, but I spent so much time attending to my partner with this, and like it's this kind of porous nature. So this is why I say like CRIP is not just an identity. It can be like a way that you look at the world and you make the world through your actions and your practices. And so I don't want to discount that. However, I do think what I will be looking at for this project will be primarily other disabled people who are supporting, just because I think it is very important that we capture the experience of disabled people that are carers and not just create this binary that only able-bodied people care for disabled people.
Yes, absolutely. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because it does raise these kind of deeper issues about the nature of experiential knowledge and so on. Is it something that just can't be communicated unless you have had that kind of experience yourself? Or is there a way in which you can kind of absorb some insights from other people's experience or experiential knowledge and pass that on? But maybe that's something for a future research project.
But that's also why I'm interested about how we can look at experiential knowledge that also links to kind of prepositional knowledge, or like knowledge of, and procedural knowledge how to. And my argument, and this is kind of what I want to explore, is that yes, disabled people will have experiential knowledge, but because you have to live in chronic time, you develop all types of procedures and you seek out knowledge of specific things. You have propositional knowledge of things. And so it's not as simple as being like, oh, you have this intangible internal experience that you can never share. There's lots of things you can share because you've developed and acquired that procedural knowledge, for example.
Yeah. Okay, great. That's really interesting. So have you had any conversations with people who have long COVID already as part of this project in preparation for the bid?
Yes.
Yeah.
So this project is very informed by my previous research podcast, Massively Disabled. And so I interviewed quite a few people with long COVID, both academics with long COVID and non-academics with long COVID.
Okay. And what's been interesting about those interviews that you've already done then? What surprised you in those interviews?
It surprised me that people were so enthusiastic about sharing their stories, and that there was quite a wide variety of people. I spoke to someone who was quite young and had long COVID and got it at university, and they were training to be a doctor. And they were told, like, my university lied to me. They told me, you're healthy and young, you don't have to worry about it. So I didn't take the precautions. And then now, like, I'm going to medical school and I have this debilitating condition. And so they felt very passionately that they wanted to be included, because they're like, what is being represented is middle-aged women, like white women. And this person was like Black and very young. And they were like, I want other people to know that you can get this at any age. And, they were very optimistic about going through medical school. But yeah, it was really interesting. Like, when we look at statistics, like, there are certain narratives that you pick up. But then when you speak to people, and then even like this person had such a great understanding of, do we even keep the term long COVID? Like, is it useful at a certain point? Because, someone who has cardiac issues will not need the same things as someone who develops like severe cognitive dysfunction. And so is it useful to use the term? But then they were saying, well, also it is useful because it allows us to tie it to a specific incident.
Yeah. And
that can be useful. And so they had very like deep understandings, and they had thought about the nuances of what this meant as well. And they were reflecting on their own training in medical school, and about how they were taught to be warned against people who perform the role of a patient.
Yes.
And so they were like, what does this mean? So basically, and this is something that I intuitively knew as someone who's interacted with medical professionals, but like to hear how they were being trained. And this, to be clear, this was in the US, so I don't know if they're doing that here in the UK. But this idea that you have to be aware that if someone is too aware of their symptoms, that it signals that they have given up on becoming well or something.
Okay.
So it's this thing where and you're like, it's like the victim mentality basically.
Right.
And you're just like, so, but if I'm not able to tell my doctor about my symptoms, where am I supposed to do that?
Right. So you're in a bind there. You're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Yes. Okay. So that's really interesting. I mean, it sounds like, so you said you were surprised by how enthusiastic people were. I suppose there could be a couple of reasons why someone might be enthusiastic. It might be because it's a kind of relief, right? Or a release rather, that somebody's asking you about this stuff that you've not had a chance to talk to people about. And it's just the fact that somebody's interested in your experience can be quite empowering and quite, you feel recognized. I suppose the other element of it might be an altruistic one, right? That it's an opportunity for them to share their knowledge and to kind of, like you said in your example, just make it clear that it's not just middle-aged people or older people who get this condition, it's younger people, and actually to pass that understanding on. So was it kind of both of those things? I suppose it would be.
Yeah, and it was interesting also to talk to people who worked in academia and people who didn't. And I interviewed someone who worked in public health and who has been very open and had a TED Talk about her experience and how her colleagues would look at her differently.
Right.
And I've spoken to other people where, the university wants them to come into a project as like a patient representative, but they won't allow them to put that on their academic CV because they see you like you're here as a patient, not as a researcher, even though they sought her out specifically for her research experience. So I think from the academics, it was also a lot of discussions around what does it mean to speak out about long COVID in a professional setting when it affected them specifically.
Yeah.
And I spoke to people, like, as I said, in public health, but also in like human geography and like different departments. And this idea, which, you know, maybe because I live in a bubble of positionality and how a lot of people in the sciences and the social sciences were kind of being challenged by the fact that like, oh, you're a long COVID advocate and you do public health studies. Like this idea that you're not just the population being studied, but you can also be the researcher is baffling to a lot of people. So from my academic interviewees, I would get.
Right, yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. What do you think needs to change in how we think about disability care and community in the wake of COVID?
Okay, there are so many things, but the one thing I will say, and the one thing I believe is like the premise for this project is living with disabled people, being in community with disabled people involves some practices and habits. So it's not about ad hoc accommodations or being like, oh, say if you can hear me and I'll turn on the mic type of thing. It has to become more of a kind of universal design of how we approach how we do things. And, you know, when I plan events, for example, I always think, okay, how can we make this accessible to most people as possible? You heard me talk about like how I thought about my research project and every stage of like, how do we make that accessible not only to participants, but also to the researchers? And so that's a lot of labor, but that is what we need to do, and not just expect disabled people to always have to advocate for themselves or only listen to them when they make the most noise, because that's exhausting. And so I think what needs to change is we need to have a shift into thinking of a charity model where you go and you're like, oh, I go and assist you out of the goodness of my heart because I feel better as a person, or even because I feel it's my ethical duty, to how do we change our relationships to work, for example. Like a lot of employers are enforcing, you know, back into the office and things like that for no rational reason, really, sometimes. But this idea of we are losing a lot of the access that was created during the height of the pandemic. And for example, let's just think about that. You're like, why are you taking it away? My educated guess is that we've all been through a social trauma, and we are not dealing with it. So everything that reminds us of COVID, like, is being stripped away. So I think it's not necessarily nefarious like a conspiracy theory, but I think it's just, you know, it was so terrible and so many people died and so many people's lives were affected, and the children who were pulled out of school and like all of these things has affected us as a society. Yes. But what I'm seeing and what other disability scholars and advocates are seeing is we're now trying to like push to this fantasy of normality and not addressing that, and that is actually hurting disabled people more. So what we need to do is maybe collectively address that trauma.
Tell me if you think this is a terrible parallel, but it just struck me as you were talking then that there's a way in which this could be compared to the experience of women during the First World War, right? So that obviously there was this incredible traumatic, you know, worldwide event, but one thing that did happen that was positive as a result of that was that women were able to get out into the workplace and, you know, do all sorts of things that they hadn't been able to do previously. And then after the war, there's a movement, oh, thank God that's all over. Everybody, get back in the home, but actually, thankfully, some of those changes actually were more lasting, right, as a result of the First World War. And you might think that something similar needs to happen here, right, that some of the advantages of that COVID, no doubt a terrible event overall, but some of the positive things that might have come out of that for disabled people need to not get lost in the rush to go back to normality.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because
Right.
that was the main point of comparison in my previous research, was the First World War.
Okay.
Because we had the double whammy of obviously loss of life on the front,
Yeah.
and destruction at home, and the Spanish flu. So there was a lot of loss of life, and actually the precursor to the NHS, the Ministry of Health, was founded in 1919, right after. So this is when they were reforming the Poor Law. So everything that had been done in terms of infrastructure in healthcare policy had a big revamp in this period. And this is where we see a turn to eugenics. The height of the eugenics movement is at that time, when they were having open discussions in public newsletters about how can we kill everyone in East London to stop them from reproducing. And the idea of who deserves help once we are in this period of scarcity of post-war, and the idea of the independent sick. And so moving towards a model where we really treat acute conditions, because those are the people who will be able to go back and serve the state. So really this idea of, that had existed before, of productivity, but now that there was so much loss of life, they started distinguishing, like, how many sons have you lost? You get more stuff, like, and et cetera. And so this is also where we see, like, persecution of spinsters and bachelors, which is code for queer people as well, like, who do not procreate and serve the state in that way. So we see this big turn. And as you say, like, now the men are back from the front, the women have to go back home, and we have this idealized, like, version of the nuclear family, and what happens with that. So yeah, I like that comparison, because, like, hopefully there are things that we will be carrying forward that are good. But I think also the lesson from that is that the feminist movement had to fight a lot.
Absolutely, yeah.
For that to happen. And then for that to, for example, if we're looking at women in the workplace, for the workplace to be viable and inclusive for women, where they won't be harassed all the time.
Yes, absolutely. And we may not even still be there yet, with that. But hopefully there is progress, even if there's, obviously backlashes and kind of regression along the way. What's next for your project then? And if people want to learn more or to get involved, where should they go?
Yeah, so I just submitted the application, so fingers crossed. I will still keep doing my own research on this. I guess you can find me on my website, ElainaGauthier-Mamaril.com, which I assume you'll be able to list in the show notes, because it's a long one to spell out. But yeah, that's my main website, and you can contact me through there if you have any questions.
Great. Well, good luck with the application. And maybe when you've done some work on the project, you'll come back and tell us how it's going.
Yeah.
That's it then. So Élaina Gauthier-Mamaril, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.